Welcome to Talking Ketamine, episode 26.
Hello. Today we're taking a slightly different angle. We're looking at how the actual scientific conversation around substances like ketamine and psilocybin is, well, how it's evolving.
Right, it's not just about the latest study results,
Hmm.
but about the tone behind them. How are scientists actually talking about this stuff?
Exactly. Because, the way science talks about these things changes, and that has real implications. It's not always straightforward.
Definitely. We know these substances, ketamine and psilocybin, they're getting so much attention now.
Yeah.
Huge potential, especially for really tough conditions like treatment-resistant depression, which we've touched on before.
We have. But the academic literature itself, well, it's not all singing from the same hymn sheet, is it?
Not at all. You see this mix.
Hmm.
There's cautious optimism for sure about the therapy side, but then there are also these persistent critical concerns about abuse, about risk. It's complex.
And that's exactly the dynamic we want to unpack today. We're using a really interesting source for this, a master's thesis from the University of Padova. It's titled, Analyzing Valence Shifts in Scientific Narratives on Psychedelics Using BERT and Topic Modeling, and it's by Oksana Abramova.
Wow. That sounds technical but important, Bert.
Mm.
That's AI, right?
It is. This study uses some pretty cutting-edge AI methods to analyze basically the sentiment, the positive or negative leaning, and the main themes in thousands of scientific papers over time.
So it's like using AI to read between the lines of scientific research on a massive scale.
That's a great way to put it. So if you're curious about this shifting story around ketamine and psilocybin in science and how researchers are using new tools to map it out, stick with us.
Yeah, we want to try and uncover those underlying feelings, the key topics, the stuff that isn't always obvious just from reading, say, a news headline about a study.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start with the core problem this thesis was trying to solve. As we said, psychedelics like psilocybin and ketamine are really making waves in neuroscience and psychiatry.
Huge waves. And it's largely driven by this therapeutic potential, especially for conditions where other treatments maybe haven't worked so well.
Right. But the challenge, as the thesis points out, is that the scientific writing itself is, quote, heterogeneous in tone.
Yeah, heterogeneous, meaning it's mixed, right? You get both this cautious optimism.
They're like, this could be amazing, but let's be careful.
Yeah, exactly. And then you also get this critical concern of abuse and risk, which, let's face it, has been a big part of the narrative for a long time.
So the study wanted to see if they could computationally measure how this tone, this valence and sentiment shifts. Does it change depending on whether a paper is talking about therapy versus substance abuse?
Precisely. Using computers to sort of track the emotional temperature, you might say, of the scientific discussion.
So how did they actually do that? You mentioned AI, SciBERT.
Yes, SciBERT. So they use a fine-tuned version of it. Think of SciBERT as like a language AI model that's been specifically trained on millions of scientific articles.
Okay, so it really gets scientific language.
It really does. Much better than a general AI would. It understands the nuances, the specific terminology, and crucially, that kind of hedged language scientists use.
Ah, hedged language.
Yeah.
Like when they say suggests instead of proves or potential instead of definite.
Exactly that. Very cautious, precise language. SciBERT is good at picking up the sentiment even within that careful style.
Okay, so that's for sentiment. What about the themes? You mentioned topic modeling.
Right, they use something called BERTopic. Topic modeling is basically a technique where the AI looks through all the text and finds clusters of words that tend to appear together.
So it figures out the main subjects being discussed, like therapy or side effects.
Pretty much, yeah. It helps identify those dominant themes automatically. So they combined the sentiment scores from SciBERT with these topics identified by BERTopic.
And looked at trends.
Trends over time, yeah, by publication year. And also within articles like, how does the sentiment change from the introduction to the discussion section?
Quite detailed.
It is, and the study emphasized precision. It wasn't just looking for obvious happy or sad words. It focused on that subtle, context-dependent language.
And they looked at the paragraph level.
Yes, paragraph-level analysis. The idea was that looking at paragraphs gives you less noise, more stability, and makes it easier to interpret why the sentiment is what it is in that specific part of the argument.
Got it. So a really sophisticated way to analyze a huge amount of text.
Definitely. And it led to some really interesting findings about how sentiments have changed over time.
Okay, let's hear them. What do they find?
Well, one of the big takeaways was about psilocybin. The study found clear trends of increasing positivity in recent publications on psilocybin.
Increasing positivity.
Yeah.
So science is sounding more optimistic about psilocybin lately.
It seems that way, yes. The tone is shifting upwards, and the thinking is this reflects its reemergence, after decades of being restricted.
Right, the whole psychedelic renaissance thing.
Exactly. It's being seriously investigated again as a therapeutic tool, and that renewed interest seems to be reflected in a more positive tone in the literature.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about ketamine? Was it the same story?
Ah, no. And this
Hmm.
is where that's really interesting. For ketamine articles, the study found a more stable sentiment trajectory.
Stable. So not that same upward swing in positivity.
Apparently not. The overall sentiment towards ketamine in the scientific literature seems to have been more consistent over time, less prone to that recent surge of optimism seen with psilocybin.
Why the difference, do you think? Or what did the study suggest?
Well, the thesis suggests it might be down to history. Psilocybin is kind of the comeback kid generating new excitement. Ketamine, though, it has a much longer established but more controversial reputation.
Right, it's been used medically for ages as an anesthetic, but it also has that history of recreational use and abuse potential.
Precisely. So that longer, more complex history, with both the therapeutic applications and the risks being known for longer, probably leads to a more, let's say, balanced or stable sentiment in the literature, less dramatic shifts.
That comparison is really insightful. The newness of psilocybin research versus the long, complex history of ketamine.
Yeah. And another fascinating layer was how sentiment changes within a single paper.
Oh, right. You mentioned they looked at different sections, so it's not just one flat tone throughout an article?
Not at all. The study found sentiment is unevenly distributed, which, when you think about it, makes sense for how science writing works, right?
Yeah, I guess so. The abstract might sound hopeful, but the limitations section might be more critical.
Exactly. They gave examples, like articles that were generally framed positively tended to have a consistently optimistic tone across the abstract, introduction, and discussion, kind of building a case.
Okay.
But articles that scored negatively overall, they often had more moderate or neutral abstracts and introductions, setting the stage.
Right, just presenting the prop.
But then the discussion sections in those negatively scored papers often showed lower average sentiment scores.
So the criticism comes out more strongly in the discussion.
Yeah, reflecting that critical tone, you often find when researchers discuss their actual results, acknowledge limitations, or point out problems, it really shows the different jobs each section of a paper does.
That's such a useful thing for anyone reading research to keep in mind. Don't just read the abstract.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, about those topics, they used what's called a semi-supervised approach. Meaning they didn't just let the AI find any topics, they gave it some starting points, some seed topics based on what they expected to find. Things like therapeutic use and abuse and risk.
Okay, so guiding the AI a bit.
Just a bit to make sure it focused on the key debates. And what they found, perhaps unsurprisingly, was that most articles showed mixed or balanced topic profiles.
So most papers weren't just about either therapy or risk, but touched on both.
Yeah, which makes sense. Good scientific papers usually try to look at things from multiple angles, right? Discuss the benefits and the challenges.
True. Rigorous science isn't usually one-sided.
But here's a real twist. They found that the sentiment, the overall tone, and the main topic being discussed, they were only weakly correlated.
Weakly correlated. Wait, so a paper mainly about therapeutic use wasn't necessarily super positive in tone.
Not necessarily, no. That's what intuition might suggest. But the data showed something more nuanced.
Wow. Okay, unpack that.
Well, for psilocybin, for instance, articles framed around therapeutic use were actually and unexpectedly associated with lower sentiment scores.
Lower. Why would talking about therapy lead to a less positive tone?
The researchers speculated it could reflect a really critical examination of treatment claims. So even while exploring the therapeutic potential, scientists were being extra rigorous, maybe highlighting the limitations, the need for more evidence, potential issues.
So the optimism was heavily tempered with scientific caution.
Exactly. Cautious optimism in the truest sense. For ketamine, it was a bit more intuitive. Therapeutic framing was linked to higher sentiment, but even then, the connection was weak.
Still weak, so it's just not a simple relationship.
Not at all. And maybe the most striking finding tying this together was that even texts focused heavily on risk could still express hope or therapeutic potential.
So a paper discussing the dangers might still have an underlying hopeful tone about future therapy.
Yes. It shows just how complex this cautious scientific discussion is. It's not black and white. A paper might detail risks, but frame it as, we need to understand these risks so that we can use this therapeutically and safely.
That is complex. It's about managing risk to achieve the potential, rather than just saying risk equals bad.
Precisely. It paints a picture of science grappling with complexity, not just giving simple answers.
This whole approach, using AI to map these subtle shifts in complexities,
Yeah.
it feels really valuable. It helps you, as you said, trace evolving framings of these, well, controversial topics in the scientific literature.
It really does. And for you listening, this isn't just academic navel-gazing. It's a tool, really, a way to understand the nuance behind the headlines.
Yeah, it helps cut through the noise, maybe, to see how the experts themselves are actually talking about ketamine and psilocybin with all the caveats and complexities.
Exactly. It shows that really understanding the science isn't just about knowing the facts presented, it's also about sensing that underlying tone, recognizing the evolving perspective, seeing the caution that's built into good research.
So as we kind of wrap this up, it's crystal clear that the scientific story around ketamine and psilocybin isn't simple. It's not just good or bad.
Absolutely not. What this study, using AI, really highlights is that scientific sentiment is, well, it's like a complex fabric. It's woven with threads of careful language, shifting understanding over time, and different viewpoints clashing or coexisting, even in the same paper.
So what's the takeaway for us, for anyone trying to follow this research, especially around mental health treatments where there's so much hope and hype?
I think it's a big reminder to look deeper. Don't just take the surface level message. Ask how things are being said, not just what is being said.
Look for that nuance, the potential shifts in tone between sections, the balance between optimism and caution.
Exactly. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and try to appreciate the full spectrum of the scientific conversation, warts and all. It's rarely as simple as it first appears.